Hello and welcome to Pit Talk, a Fox Sports and Speed Cafe Formula One podcast. And on today's very special episode, Daniel Ricciardo is back on the Formula One grid after AlphaTauri swings the axe on rookie Nyck de Vries. That is, of course, the subject in entirety of this special episode, twice in 1 week. Imagine that. My name's Michael Laminato, motorsport writer for Fox Sports Australia. It's great to have your company. And on what can only be described as a celebratory Australian episode, joined by Speed Cafe's Matt Kosh. Matt, what a day.
It's huge, isn't it? I mean, we've shunted Ian Parks out the door. He's tucked up in bed over in the UK somewhere. So we've got the all Aussie. We can go proper ochre on this one.
Proper
and you know, as McLaren said at Abu Dhabi last year, yeehaw DR. He's back. You know, I've got the hat there over this side. There it is. This is monumental because it's come out of the blue, hasn't it? I mean, we were talking off air that I didn't see this coming. In fact, I've gone on record. I've written a piece saying, no, that doesn't make sense. He's not going to AlphaTauri, not a chance. And well, I think that's for lunch because I'm going to have to eat it, I think.
Valuable lunch, got to say. It could be a collector's item in the future. I mean, there's so many different angles we can attack this with, so many different talking points to come out of this one. Let's start with Nyck de Vries, which is obviously where all of this started. There would have been no opportunity for Daniel to be getting back on the grid had Nyck de Vries been performing, obviously, at the level that Red Bull and, in particular, Helmut Marko, Red Bull Motorsport Advisor, had expected him to perform at. On the one hand, that kind of makes sense, right? He's come in with a big reputation and hasn't really been a match even close for most races to Yuki Tsunoda. He's come in with such a reputation. But on the other hand, this is only round 10, Matt. We're not even at the mid-season break, which is when we normally get the still ruthless decisions to axe drivers halfway through the season. Has his season really been that bad? Because, to be honest, and I'm talking only 24 hours in the past now, I wasn't convinced that it had even been bad enough to axe him.
There must be something there that they have access to that we don't, because you're looking at the AlphaTauri isn't a good car. Let's not dress it up like it's some race-winning car that's being held back by its drivers. It's clearly not. Everyone says Yuki Tsunoda is doing a good job, and he's still got 2 points to his name in 10 races. So the car is what it is. That's not helping his cause. But even by Red Bull standards, this is brutal. I mean, Red Bull don't do niceties very much. But to get a holiday before the holidays is just extraordinary. He hasn't been that bad. He's made 1 or 2 mistakes, but every rookie does. Every rookie goes through a crashing phase. Yuki Tsunoda went through a crashing phase. The team moved him from the UK to Faenza so they could keep tabs on him and they could make him train properly. And yet here we are, 10 races in. Yeah, de Vries hasn't scored a point, but the car doesn't really deserve one in normal circumstances. So what have they seen that they don't like? I mean, does anything stick out to you? Because I can't think of anything off the top of my head that makes me think he's not good enough for Formula. I mean, the guy's a Formula E world champion, so he's got some talent. He's won the GP2 series as well, or GP2 championship, or Formula 2 as it is these days, showing my age. So yeah, he knows how to drive a car. You don't forget that stuff, do you?
No, well, I mean, it is a really interesting point, isn't it? Because coming into this season, I did expect him to perform relatively well, accepting a period of adjustment because Formula E, where he's come from, is pretty different to Formula One in so many respects. Not only the speed and the style of car, but the driving style is really, really different. I mean, you can kind of see in his times, he's not been improving relative to Tsunoda. I had a look at the numbers briefly for a Fox Sports article. His improvement over the course of the season has been almost negligible relative to Tsunoda, and that does acknowledge the difficulty of the car, but nonetheless, your teammate is your number one bar. I think the thing for me is, we talk about Nyck as a rookie, but he's not really like any other rookie we've had at recent times as well in Formula One. He's 28 years old. The age is just a number, to use a phrase, but he's 28 years old arriving in Formula One because, as you say, he's had time to win championships elsewhere. He's raced in the sports cars, rather, not the supercars, not yet anyway. He's raced in sports cars, he's raced in a whole bunch of junior series, and he's tasted success in a variety of them. Not wild success, but except for the World Championship, obviously, but it's not as if he dominated that series or anything like that. He's just been very good in them. So he's arrived in Formula One not with rookie expectations, with the expectations of a guy who has a lot of experience, kind of similar to Brendan Hartley, I guess, if we wanted to think of a parallel. He was given more time, admittedly, but he arrived with, again, sports cars wins, expecting to be kind of a bit of a stabilizing influence in the team, and then found that transition much more difficult. So that's the only way I can really, I guess, rationalize this pretty quick decision, is that actually they weren't expecting a rookie. They were expecting a guy to deliver a lot more for the team. And strangely enough, we've arrived in a season when Yuki Tsunoda was under a lot of pressure to prove himself, and he's become almost seamlessly the team leader. And I think that flipping of expectations has just been so dramatic that the teams had to say, well, why have we got this guy for? And I guess also, to use one of Mark Webber's favourite phrases, this is not a finishing school Formula One, and that is least of all the case for a guy who is as decorated as Nick was.
It's going to be interesting because you mentioned Tsunoda there sort of coming into his own now. He's the team leader. Is he the team leader now? Because you're bringing in a guy that's an 8-time race winner. How does Yuki react to that? How does Daniel perform in the first instance? I mean, you've got to imagine that he's going to get his doors blown off in probably the first couple of races. But that's going to be an interesting dynamic as well. And for me, it's the end game here. AlphaTauri coming in mid-season, that's the play for now. But what are they playing towards for Daniel? Are they trying to give Sergio Perez a hurry up? Are they trying to give Yuki Tsunoda a hurry up? With a view to Red Bull next year. And we know Perez has got a contract there until the end of next season. Contracts don't mean anything in Formula One. Just ask Nyck de Vries.
Exactly.
So, I mean, just ask Daniel for that matter. He walked out.
At least he could negotiate his way out of his contract.
Well, yeah, when he left McLaren, he had to carry an extra suitcase, didn't he? But contracts are malleable in Formula One, so just because he's got a deal there doesn't necessarily mean anything. People talk about the Mexican money that Perez brings. I don't buy it. Red Bull doesn't need the cash. It subsidizes it a little bit, but whatever. The marketing value that they get out of Daniel is enormous, which is half the reason they brought him back. That was the sole purpose of bringing Daniel into the fold, is that his marketing value. He's been going on primetime TV in the United States. He did that watch-along thing. Where was that? The other race in
Canada.
Yeah, so there's a marketing value to him. So it's interesting to unravel what that end game is, because I can only read this as a throw of the dice for Daniel in getting back to Red Bull, because otherwise, why would you go to AlphaTauri? Even if they invest money, which I hear they're doing, even if they invest money, that's a 5-year project. That's not something that's going to turn around in the short term. He's 33, 34. He doesn't have that. Well, he's not Fernando Alonso at this point, so maybe he has that time. But he doesn't really have that time to sit there and wait and build that team up. And they're just never going to challenge Red Bull anyway. They've got the flagship team. So this has got to be a play for Sergio's seat.
It's such a beautiful irony that Daniel ended last season saying, I'll only come back with a front-running team, and he's gone for the worst team in Formula One at the moment by points and performance. No disrespect, of course, to AlphaTauri. He has great potential, but this year, I mean, it is the slowest car. That's just the fact. I love as well, I mean, this is really, when you cut it down, boil it down, this is such a Red Bull move, isn't it? In every respect, not just the ruthlessness of it. We know that is such a Red Bull trademark, but it's the fact as well that putting Daniel in at this point in particular serves so many different causes at once in a way that's almost really Machiavellian. Now we will talk about sort of the game, as you mentioned, the end game for Daniel here, but obviously having him in a seat, even having him as a reserve driver, but now in a seat, puts pressure on Sergio Perez, right? And we know Red Bull just loves putting pressure on drivers. Like, its way of finding diamonds is to put them under pressure, not to give them time to sort themselves out. So it puts Perez under pressure, puts Yuki Tsunoda under pressure, because for all the way we've been talking this year about him having a great season, and that's probably true, he's in his third season now. Now, that's this is normally the last year at AlphaTauri, the kind of junior blooding team. This is his moment to prove that actually the 3 years have really delivered something great, or maybe he wilts against Daniel Ricciardo. Puts Daniel under pressure too. We've talked a lot about this year how he's been welcomed into open arms at Red Bull as the prodigal son, and it's such a good news story and everyone's happy. He's back in the grinder now. He's lost that special status as the third driver who's kind of immune from criticism. Well, it's up to him now. And it also, in a weird way, and this is sort of the external element of it puts a bit of pressure on their up-and-coming young drivers who are not yet in Formula One, thinking particularly about Liam Lawson. Now, he's performing really well in Super Formula, so it's not as if he needs a bit of a hurry-up, but it does put a little bit of impetus on him now to say, at the end of the year, my results have to be so good that I'm really making Red Bull think about their driver lineup, since they've got such an abundance of drivers. It's just on every level such a Red Bull move to figure out where they want to really be next year. Because the other thing I think is really interesting here is that obviously he's been given 12 races, Daniel, to prove it. There's no promise of it running into next year. Potentially he ends up at Red Bull. Maybe he sticks to another AlphaTauri, or maybe he's out of the sport at the end of the year. We've got a really short shootout scenario, I guess.
Yeah, and this isn't a move that's happened overnight. This isn't in reaction to the British Grand Prix. This has been in the works for a while. I remember speaking to Daniel's manager in Monaco, in fact, and he was saying, they're doing some good things at AlphaTauri. He didn't tell me anything, but he certainly hinted that there were conversations happening. And I know at that point they were talking to Christian Horner about how they might be able to get themselves into a car. But that was for next year. That wasn't for this year. So things have accelerated, but this isn't born out of the blue. Red Bull, it looks like it makes rash decisions, but it doesn't. They're very, as you alluded to, they're very calculated. They're designed to apply pressure. Like even Max, this sort of puts him on notice. Yes, he's the benchmark and he's a runaway championship leader, but it shows that there are no sacred cows. There is nowhere to hide. If you're not performing, then you're out of the door. So it's going to be a big 12 races for Daniel, and how we measure that success is going to be incredibly difficult because we can't expect him to be scoring points. So is beating Yuki Tsunoda, is that good enough? Is matching Tsunoda, is that good enough? Where's the marker now of success or failure for Daniel? Is that something that we're going to be able to see externally? Because not all of these things we necessarily can. I mean, we just spoke about why Red Bull has ditched Nyck de Vries when we're saying, well, he hasn't had that bad a year, but clearly they've seen something or they know something that we don't to do that. So there's all this data behind the scenes that they've got access to that could also be a measure of success or failure that we're never going to know, that could very well decide the future, not just of Daniel, but potentially Sergio. Liam Lawson, who I think is really unlucky. I think that kid is good enough to be in Formula One. He's doing good things over in Super Formula. Daniel's next 12 races will impact his Formula One career. That's how fickle Formula One is. Your future, you've done everything right. Liam Lawson has won races in Super Formula. He's led the championship there. I think he's dropped to second. They're racing this weekend, off the top of my head. He's won races in Formula 2. I got it right this time. And he's done everything he needs to do all the way along. But it's not enough. It's a case of being in the right place at the right time and having the right conversations. So it's really going to be fascinating because this is a bigger play than 12 races to see what Daniel can do. This is 12 races to see if Sergio can turn it around because, being bumped out of qualifying in Silverstone wasn't good enough. He's got to be under pressure. So it's Hungary. Let's not read anything into that. That's going to be a learning experience. Daniel's been at that team before, but it was a long time ago. We're talking 10 odd years. So there's going to be an adjustment period. There's going to be a case of learning the team, learning the car, all that sort of stuff. We won't know how he's going until probably maybe Japan or Singapore, because after the break you go Netherlands, Monza. So that's 4 races either side of the break that he'll be learning. If he goes out and he beats Tsunoda, then let's start talking about him. But we need to cut him some slack because expectations, I don't think we can have a high bar for him to clear straight off the bat.
I'm just trying to imagine him in the AlphaTauri team, and I'm struggling. So I'm really keen to get
Is white his colour?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not convinced. Maybe it'll look great, but it shouldn't look too good, obviously, because that's not the final goal for him. I want to come back to that expectations of performance because obviously that's the whole point of this experiment. But I do just want to sort of wrap up on Liam Lawson, I suppose. It's really interesting, and thinking about this before the announcement was made, I couldn't help but think by the end of this year, Red Bull's in a really interesting situation, assuming that Lawson continues his really good form in Super Formula, and he has been. I think we're around about 5 or 6 rounds into that season, and he's been pretty consistently good. Like you say, second in the championship and not far off. If he gets to the end of the year and is second or even wins that title, and you've got Nyck de Vries not improving, but you've got Daniel Ricciardo doing good work in the simulator, all that kind of stuff, as evidently he has been the whole time, if they've made this decision, it puts the whole Red Bull environment in a really interesting situation, because you've got 2 drivers theoretically competing for just de Vries' seat, assuming Tsunoda gets retained, which
and Ayumu Iwasa in Formula 2 as well.
Yes, exactly. Who's doing really well through the championship at the moment, second season there, so he's also logically knocking on the door. I guess this decision kind of starts that ball rolling early, doesn't it? Because now, if you're Helmut Marko, who maybe is prioritizing having the young guys in the team, given that's kind of his domain, contrary to Christian Horner, who just wants sort of like the established guys to be performing strongly and seems to be a backer of Daniel, judging by everything we've heard him say in the last couple of weeks. This gets part of that decision-making done now. You've got 12 races, and it is really, you can look at the Daniel decision 2 ways, can't you? You can think, okay, on the one hand, great, he's been given a bit of a favour or a gift by the Red Bull team that really likes him and all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, you're throwing him straight into the deep end, back into Formula One. He's only had a few months to kind of decompress from the McLaren thing. He's never driven this particular car before either. In a way, Helmut Marko, Red Bull would love one of 2 outcomes, right? And I can't wait for the end of the year to find out there was a third outcome we hadn't realised. Is that Daniel, blows everyone's socks off and he's at Red Bull next year. Or he fails and he's out of the equation. We don't have to think about him anymore. And you put in Liam Lawson, and then maybe even if, whatever, you could replace Tsunoda if you want with Ayumu Iwasa or whatever. It really gets a head start on that driver situation for them, because while we don't have a massive pipeline, I guess, of Red Bull talent at the moment, there are enough knocking on the door that we're starting to get back to those days of juggling drivers for Red Bull.
Christian Klein and Vitantonio Liuzzi, they shared a drive way back in the day. That worked really well for them. But the other thing here is we've always considered AlphaTauri, or before that Toro Rosso, is the junior team. And we're assuming that that's what it's going to remain. Now, I know earlier in the year there was serious conversations about that team being sold to Hi-Tech. Now, Hi-Tech is currently a junior team, but it's one of those entities that submitted an application to join Formula One in the coming seasons, along with Andretti. So there were conversations there. That deal didn't go ahead. We know that AlphaTauri is being rebranded at the end of the year. We don't know what to, but we know it's being rebranded at the end of the year. We also know that it's an entity that now needs to stand up and wash its own face, where previously Red Bull has been willing to just more or less bankroll that, knowing that it's, to borrow Mark Webber's term, the finishing school for its Red Bull drivers. So are we assuming that AlphaTauri is going to remain a junior team and not become a fully fledged serious operation? Not to say it wasn't in the past, but you know what I mean. Operation in its own right. It's now no longer about developing talent. It's about going out there and getting genuine results. A little bit like, I guess, it was when Sebastian Vettel was there in, 2005, 2006. So if that's the case, maybe there is a third game that's being played. It's like that. You go out there, you got the street merchants. They've got the 3 cups and the ball underneath. I feel like we're playing that at the moment. The problem is we don't know which cup the ball's under yet.
Yeah, we don't even know what the ball looks like at this point in time, so we've got to figure that out first. So what are your expectations for him? We've talked a little bit about how he's going to need an adjustment period, and that's true, because a lot of the, I guess, hype, if you like, around Daniel this season has been his work in the simulator for Red Bull Racing. Supposedly the tyre test that sold the deal for him, although it sounds a lot like the deal was done before he even got in the car on Tuesday, but that was in, again, a Red Bull Racing car. And I think the only footage we've got out of that was actually him spinning the car at Luffield, but that's by the by. Apparently his times were quite competitive. We don't know what the tyres, all that kind of stuff. Now he's jumping in, as we've said, the car literally the reverse end of the grid. You flip them around, you've got a Red Bull bookending the entire championship. What can we expect? What do you think? What do you instinctively think is the outcome of success for him? And can we really expect him to get a handle on Tsunoda by the end of this year?
He has to. It's that simple, basically. If he's not beating Yuki Tsunoda consistently by the end of the year, I'm sorry, no, I hate to say this because I'm a big fan of Daniel. It's not good enough. He has to beat the established benchmark. That's the way Formula One works. It is a meritocracy, and you either beat it or you beat it. Basically, it's. I don't think we can put a measure of, he needs to score 10 points or he needs to score points at 3 races. I don't think you can put that because the midfield is too variable. As we've said on previous episodes of the podcast, every time updates come, that order seems to change around. So I don't think we can read anything into that and put a number on it because we don't know, and probably the team doesn't know how it's going to fare. But what we need to see is Daniel, in the first couple of races, inching his way towards Tsunoda, and then from there on being right with him, if not a little bit ahead. Beyond that, it's going to be in the finer detail, in the data that we don't see, in the marketing value that he brings, in the feedback he's offering to the team, in the simulator value that he offers. Because that's something that we also don't know. How much time has he had in this car? That's something that you mentioned to me off air. We know he's been in the Red Bull simulator. Has he been driving the AlphaTauri car in there as well? We don't know. We don't know how prepared he is. You've got to imagine that he's going to be in there every moment he possibly can be between now and Hungary in a couple of weeks' time. But this is, this has got to be a roll of the dice. There are no guarantees here, and if this doesn't work, Daniel's Formula One career is pretty well done. Because after McLaren, if he doesn't succeed against Yuki Tsunoda in an AlphaTauri, I'm sorry, no one's going to want him.
It is really interesting, isn't it? I mean, to go back to the point that he'd previously said he wasn't interested in a backmarker team, it was precisely because he would struggle to make an impact to prove that he'd reversed his fortunes at McLaren, right? Like if he were driving for Haas this year, it would be very difficult to see that he was back to his old self. I think probably in retrospect he wouldn't have been. I think he sort of said that he needed the time out a little bit and also a familiar environment to kind of work those McLaren-formed kinks out of his driving style. I think it actually has been a very valuable 6 months for him. But still, that fundamental issue, I guess, with a backmarking team remains, is that it's really difficult to prove himself. I guess that benefit is that the team he's aiming for owns this team, so they will see. They'll see in the data, as you mentioned. But it is a really fascinating situation, also partly because we almost certainly, unless he scores some really big results and he's obviously smashing or being smashed by Yuki Tsunoda, it'll be difficult to know how it's going because he's probably going to be finishing out of the points often, I don't know, 14th, 15th, something like this. Hard to know what success looks like. Let's flip this around though. For Yuki Tsunoda, coming into this season, he knew he was under pressure, considering his first 2 years was sort of so-so. We've seen a lot of speed from him, but a lot of inconsistency. This year, by all accounts, he's ticking all of the boxes. How much does this flip his season back on its head again to prove himself? Because I can't help but think back to, particularly given it's Daniel who's joining, Lando Norris's attitude in the car, I guess, when Daniel Ricciardo joined McLaren. He was the young guy who, okay, he wasn't under pressure because he was doing so well, but was under pressure to ensure he was established in the team. Yuki Tsunoda's had this opportunity to become a team leader. It's a big moment for him.
Yeah, again, it's career defining. The next 12 races are critical to the future of both of them. Now, Yuki has the backing of Honda, and he's been linked with a move to Aston Martin in future seasons. Aston Martin obviously has the Honda work still as of 2026, but that's still a couple of years away. So he needs a seat up until then. 12 races, and you've got a race winner coming in next to you. He has ended the career of Nyck de Vries. So that's a really good endorsement of him already. He came in and he turned that wild potential that he had in his first couple of seasons. He's harnessed that. He's still wild on the radio. He's fantastic on the radio. But he's managed to channel that. Can he now keep a lid on it? Because that pressure is just ramped up again. Again, if he's getting beaten by Daniel, some serious questions need to be asked about Yuki. Because if Daniel's good enough to beat him, then is he that good? If Daniel's got no experience in that car? It's a question that we don't have the answer to, and Red Bull hopefully do, or AlphaTauri hopefully do. But if he's getting beaten, that's a problem. If he's beating Daniel, then he probably looks even more like a star, because he came into Formula One with huge huge raps coming out of the junior formula. And we've seen glimpses, but we've never really seen him deliver on that consistently. Certainly not in terms of getting results, because where he is at the moment, as you say, sort of P14, 15 is about what that car is capable of doing. You and I, we're not going to write headlines about Yuki Tsunoda finishing a stunning 15th. It's just, it's not that interesting. But if that's what the car is capable of doing, he has to deliver that. And if he's not doing that, and Daniel Ricciardo is, then maybe Liam Lawson's got another chance. Because this ultimately, Liam Lawson's got to be sitting on the sidelines here, rubbing his hands together, because it seems as though at the end of the year, one of those seats is going to be free. The question is, which one? My guess is going to be the Daniel seat, because he'll either be upgraded to Red Bull or he'll be out. So I think this is good news for Liam Lawson alongside him. I think Yuki will be safe, regardless if he gets his doors blown off by Daniel. But it is a really interesting test. These next probably half dozen races, we'll get a read on how things are starting to go. And if Yuki starts to get beaten, yeah, maybe he's not as good as we thought. But in that instance, what do you do with him? Who do they replace him with? There's not really anyone other than Liam waiting in the wings. And if he's getting beaten, you promote Daniel, logically, depending what Sergio is doing. You don't put Daniel in there for a second year. So, yeah, this is where we go back to those moving cups. We don't know. Helmut Marko is the master of keeping us all guessing. And then sometimes breaking the news far too early. Or
too late.
Yeah, well, it was interesting in Abu Dhabi last year. Helmut Marko said on, I think it was German television, that, oh yeah, we've signed Daniel Ricciardo, and this was on the Friday from memory.
I thought it was in Brazil even,
yeah,
wasn't it? It was almost a week earlier.
I was at the event, and I went to the team and asked for confirmation, and they said, hasn't been signed. Contract hasn't been signed. It's not done. It was looking that way, but it's not done. So we didn't run it. And I know when he signed the contract because I was there. I was physically there watching him sign the contract. At which point we ran it. But it's interesting because this is I've said it before, a roll of the dice for Daniel, and by proxy a roll of the dice for Yuki. He's got to beat Daniel if he's going to have a serious career in Formula One. If he doesn't, someone else might pick him up, but he's going to be a journeyman type driver that, you know, sort of what I guess Paul di Resta was, or I was trying to think of another Red Bull driver who's actually moved on from that team and done other things. I mean, Vitantonio Liuzzi, he ended up at HRT, Hispania Racing Team, that colossus of a Formula One operation.
Gave Daniel Ricciardo his debut.
Well, it's true. It did. It did. 2010 British Grand Prix. So we're almost full circle.
Yeah, I was thinking about this during the week, thinking, oh, look, gosh, that's the anniversary of Daniel Ricciardo's debut at Silverstone. Imagine that. And lo and behold. This
is going to be interesting because I remember Silverstone 2010, I wasn't at that event, but I was at Hungary, which was the next event. And he had a media call, as all the drivers do at the end of the day on the Friday. And I went to HRT, or Hispania, I forget what it was called that week. It was like that for that team.
It was a cool spot, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I was the only person there. I had Daniel to myself for 15 minutes. I dare say that won't be the case this week.
Yeah.
And he's going to have probably the most subscribed media calls of anyone all weekend. I wonder if AlphaTauri really know what is about to hit them. I mean, in Monaco, Nyck de Vries attracted quite a crowd because that's where the pressure really ratcheted up on him. So it's an exciting little period. We're going to have 2 Australians on the grid. In fact, we're going to have 3 Australians on the grid because we're going to have Oscar Piastri, Daniel Ricciardo, and then way down the back, even behind Daniel, Carl Reiner in the medical car this weekend. So 3 Australians on the grid. That has never happened before.
Yeah.
We did have 3 Australians at the 1977 British Grand Prix, but Brian Maguire didn't pre-qualify, so doesn't count. But we'll claim this one with Carl in the Aston Martin.
Yeah, go get him, Carl. finally, I mean, we've mentioned this a couple of times, but this is the big question everyone is interested in, of course, is the big game. It's the end game. It's Sergio Perez. We talked about how contracts evidently mean a limited amount at Red Bull. Just ask Nyck de Vries. It has been, I guess, the shield Red Bull has in part been batting off questions about Perez's future, the fact that he is contracted for another year, and Perez as well. He's been in a pretty terrible form slump. You know, we talked on this podcast after Austria how it looked like maybe we were seeing the green shoots of recovery, had a really good sprint and sprint qualifying, and then a pretty solid race as well, getting onto the podium. Britain felt like a step backwards. We know there were reasons in qualifying why he wasn't able to get out of Q1, but I mean, other drivers in worse cars did. And he's talked about how he's not comfortable in the car in certain conditions. And we've heard him in even the last couple of seasons talk about how he's not always fully confident in what he can do with the car. I understand, as we've sort of already talked about, how Red Bull likes to prove drivers by putting them under pressure. In that sense, it makes perfect sense that you would have had Daniel waiting constantly in the wings, in the simulator, in the motorhome, and now he's actually in a car on the grid. But we know how Perez has to respond to this. How do you think he will respond to this? Because to my mind, while he's been always a survivor in Formula One, the fact he's made it to Red Bull, you know, in the later stages of his career, let's say, is testament to that. In my mind, he's also not necessarily the hardest driver mentally in these kind of situations. What do you expect to see from him?
So I'll counter that point when you say his mental toughness with you look back at the furore at the end of last year when think of Brazil, where he let Max through and then Max wouldn't let him back through, and that, we believe, it's never been confirmed by anyone, but we believe that stemmed back to Perez crashing in Monaco and scoring pole and denying Max Verstappen. So there's been tension bubbling away behind the scenes for more than a year. You know, Monaco last year was more than a year ago. They put this happy family persona out there. Sergio seems to be pushing on with what Sergio does and approaching the race weekend the way he feels he needs to, which is different to what Christian Horner thinks he should be doing. Christian thinks, well, Max has already got the championship wrapped up. Take the pressure off yourself and just go back to the basics that he knows he can do well. But Sergio isn't doing that. He said after the British Grand Prix that he's got the support of the management. Well, in football terms, we know what that means. Usually means you're on out of the job in a couple of weeks' time. So, like it is for Yuki, where he has to go and prove himself, and like it is for Daniel, who has to do the same, Sergio has to step up. Sergio has to start finding the form that he had in the opening couple of rounds of this year, where it looked like we were going to have a battle for the Drivers' World Championship. Max is now 99 points clear. That horse is bolted. Sergio now has to ring fence second. He has to make sure that Red Bull eases to the Constructors' Championship. I mean, it should. It's a long way ahead. I think it's got more points in hand than what Mercedes has in second. Actually, here's an interesting point. By Sergio Perez not delivering, he lessens the championship points that Red Bull has, which in turn cheapens Red Bull's entry fee for next year, because entry fee is based on the number of points. So he might actually financially be doing Red Bull a favour here. Not that Red Bull wants that favour. It must be out. No. So yeah, he's got to find his Saturday form. That's where it is. His single lap form is just not there. His race pace has been okay, but in that car, you'd expect it to be okay. We know the Ferrari eats its tyres. We know the Mercedes is inconsistent. We know the Aston Martin didn't work in Silverstone. The McLaren historically eats its tyres as well. So there's no one there head for head that can match the Red Bull on a Sunday. But there are a few cars there that can get close on a Saturday. And as a result, a small mistake on a Saturday is hugely costly. And he's made, 4, 5 in a row now? You can't do that when you're driving for a team that in Hungary can equal McLaren's 1988 record of 11 wins in a row. If it gets to Belgium and wins there, it's the most successful single run, run in a single season in the sport's history. This is the sort of quality we're talking about at Red Bull at the moment. It's astronomically what they're doing. It's better than Mercedes ever was in that 7 or 8 years of domination. So, can you imagine during that period, Valtteri Bottas or Nico Rosberg or Lewis Hamilton not delivering for Mercedes and what they would have done. That's the point that we're getting to, I think, with Sergio Perez.
It has set us up for a fascinating, not only 2 races before the break, rather unexpectedly, but also a second half of the season. It is great news for Australian Formula One fans. 2 Australians on the grid, and potentially long-term terrific news for Daniel Ricciardo if he can deliver with this 12-race lifeline. I can't wait for next weekend's Hungarian Grand Prix. A little bit more than a week until we get to see this really interesting driver play in action. We'll be back next week, though, to preview the Hungarian Grand Prix and probably talk a little bit more about the fallout from this driver switch. You can subscribe to Pit Talk wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube as well if you're not already watching us there. So until next week, for Matt Kosh, I'm Michael Laminato. We'll see you then.